Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell, a Catholic variety program on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio here in Jackson, Michigan. And I am Phillip Campbell. I will be your host, the voice you have to listen to blab for the next 27 minutes and 45 seconds. So I hope the blabbing is at least interesting to you. Lately, in the news, this program has been recorded in summer of 2020. There's a lot of talk about Turkey right now. Turkey has converted the Hagia Sophia church back into a mosque. Now, Hagia Sophia used to be the grandest church in Christendom. It was the church in the city of Constantinople, the capital of the old Byzantine Empire. After the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. But then around the time of World War I, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the building was converted into a museum, which kind of corresponded with the secularization of Turkey after the war. And it's been a museum for over 100 years. But just recently, now in the summer of 2020, the Turkish President Erdogan, who is moving Turkey towards a more Islamist sort of culture, he has authorized the reopening of Hagia Sophia as a mosque, to the great protest of the Christian world, and even amongst non-Christians who see this as an offense, something offensive to Christians who are still a significant minority in Turkey. So this really got me thinking about questions relating to Islam and Christianity over there in the East, in the old lands of Byzantium. Of course, the entirety of Turkey used to be Christian. It used to be part of the Byzantine Empire, the province of Anatolia, and it was subdivided into all these other provinces. It used to be some of the oldest Christian churches. Communities in the world came out of Anatolia, like Ephesus, where St. John the Apostle was bishop, or Smyrna, one of the churches that the angel addresses in the book of Revelation. So the Christian communities in this part of the world are very ancient. So, but today I wanted to talk about the Byzantines and the Arabs, specifically the siege of Constantinople. Note, not the 1453 siege where the empire fell, but a much earlier one that ended in Christian victory. I'm talking about the siege of Constantinople in the year 717 AD. And so I want to set the stage for this. If we go back in time to the 7th century, around the year 630, the Byzantine Empire was concluding a successful war with Persia. The Byzantines, under their emperor Heraclius, had been fighting Persia for decades, and it was a very hard-fought war. At times, the future of the empire was in question, but by 630, the war had been concluded with a Byzantine victory, and the Byzantines finally settled down to enjoy a hard-fought peace. Little did the Byzantines know that their hard-fought victory would bring them scarcely 3 years of peace before they were compelled to take up the sword again against a very new and different foe, no longer the Persians, but the Arabs, who were at that time flooding out of Arabia under the impetus of the new religion of Islam. Now, this really coincided with the Byzantine victory. Just as the Byzantines were concluding the war with Persia, the Islamic founder Muhammad was bringing his unification of Arabia to completion, and the new religion of Islam was about to burst out upon the world. Muhammad died around 632, and the following year, the caliphs, his successors, would begin attacking both Byzantium and Persia. Now, this early period in Islamic history, the few generations right after the death of Muhammad, when all of the Islamic world was united, is called the period of the Rajidun Caliphate. This was before the Muslims split into Sunni and Shia. And The armies of the Rajidun Caliphate spread out all over the Middle East. They were led by their cavalry, which were swift, motivated by zeal for their new faith, and really pushing forward with momentum from their previous conquests. Now, Byzantium and Persia were both exhausted and broke from decades of expensive warfare, and consequently, they were unable to put up any real optimal resistance. And so they were easy prey for the attacks of the Rajidun Caliphate. And so the Middle East began to fall to the Arabs. After the Arabs had been pestering and chipping away at the Byzantine borders for a few years, the Emperor Heraclius decided to put up a counterattack, and so he sent a massive army under his brother Theodore to fight the Arabs in Syria. And Heraclius himself traveled to Syria to await news of the outcome of the battle. The Arabs and the Christian armies clashed at a place called the Yarmouk River in Syria, and this battle of Yarmouk in the year 636 was a disaster for the Byzantines. The Rajidun cavalry managed to surround the Byzantine army and drive most of the army over a cliff. And you can still see the gorge at Yarmouk today, where the height is between 90 and 200 feet. So the majority of the Byzantine army was shoved over this cliff into the Yarmouk River. The Byzantines lost an astonishing 50,000 killed, compared with only 3,000 Muslims lost. The emperor's brother Theodore was also killed. Now, this astonishing victory over the powerful Byzantine Empire must have seemed like a divine confirmation of the conquests of the Rajidun and the Islamic religion. And it was supremely demoralizing for the Byzantines. As I said, they'd already been fighting for decades against the Persians, and now for them to lose 50,000 men in a single battle, I mean, this was something that the Byzantines could not maintain this level of losses. Emperor Heraclius had been waiting for word of the battle at the citadel in Antioch in Syria to hear the outcome of things. And when he heard of the loss, he was very disheartened. He took the true cross from Jerusalem and had it sent to Constantinople for safekeeping. He knew, he could foresee that he was going to be unable to hold the Holy Land. And so he sent away the most precious relic in Jerusalem. Then he got on a ship back home, and as he prepared to sail, he looked out over Antioch and over his dominions and said, "Farewell, a long farewell to Syria, my fair province. Thou art an infidel's now. Peace be with you, O Syria. What a beautiful land you will be for the enemy." And then he sailed away from Syria, never to return. Now, the following year, the Muslims took both Jerusalem and Antioch, depriving the Byzantines of Syria and Palestine and cutting the empire in half, because the Byzantines still controlled parts of North Africa and Egypt. So now Egypt was completely cut off from the rest of the empire, and it was only a matter of time until that fell as well. Soon after, the Rajidun armies swept into Egypt, dusted out the remnants of the Byzantine garrison that were stranded there, and claimed the province for the Caliphate. This was a devastating loss to Byzantium. Egypt, ever since the time of the old Roman Empire, Egypt had been a source of a source of wealth in terms of taxes, luxury items, but also grain imports. Egypt had been the breadbasket of the East for centuries upon centuries. And so the loss of Egypt to the Rajidun Caliphate dealt Byzantium a severe economic blow from which it would never truly recover. Now, as a side note, it is also said that this is the time when the ancient library of Alexandria was destroyed by the Islamic armies. We don't know if that's true. There's an apocryphal story that the Caliph Umar comes to the ancient library of Alexandria, which by this time had been there for over 800 years, and had the library destroyed because he saw no reason to preserve the ancient knowledge prior to the coming of Islam. That view is increasingly questioned, but I should mention it. At any rate, we're kind of setting the stage here for the siege of Jerusalem. Heraclius died in 641. He had pursued a vigorous but limited resistance against the Arabs. Perhaps had he lived longer, he might have had more success. But when he died, the empire was divided in half and in grave peril from the new Arab threat. And indeed, the new Arab forces could have gone on and probably even taken more Byzantine lands than they did, except for the outbreak of an Arab civil war, which gave Byzantium some breathing room. Civil war breaks out in the Rajidun Caliphate in 655, and this civil war will rage for a long time, for several years. This is the beginning of the conflict that's going to split Islam into two factions, the Sunni and the Shia. So this Arab civil war pauses the conquest. The Arabs lose their momentum, and as the Caliphate fights among itself for 7 years. When the Caliphate is restored, it's going to be under a new dynasty called the Umayyads, who are going to rule for several centuries in the late first millennium. Now, the Byzantines, finally gaining a respite from nonstop Arab aggression, used this period to reform their antiquated military in order to make it better suited to the needs of their own day. They do some restructuring. They restructure the way that provinces are divided up, how the military is funded, how taxes are collected. They try to kind of do this overhaul of the imperial military bureaucracy to just make things more streamlined. And this is a good thing they did, because they were definitely going to need more flexibility. Unfortunately, things got bad in Byzantium. You have this period of raids and revolutions from that really last from 668 to 717. Very dark years for the empire. Constant rebellions, raids by Arab pirates. You have the migration of the Bulgars into the Balkans, who at that time were a pagan tribe that were bent on pillaging and looting Byzantium's western frontiers. Losses of other territories in North Africa. From 695 to 717, there's a period where it's just things are so bad in Byzantium, it's simply called the 20 Years Anarchy. There's constant palace intrigues, political coups, assassinations, and the resources of the Byzantine Empire being turned against itself in a struggle for power. And this was quite unfortunate, because it was right then, at the apex of this 20 years anarchy, that the Muslims under the Umayyads decided to regroup and attack Byzantium a second time. And this is going to lead into the famous and epic siege of Constantinople of the year 717. So the Umayyad Muslims sensed the weakness in the Byzantine Empire. They'd been watching this 20 years anarchy unfolding. They had gone through their own civil war, and now they were consolidated. They were ready to fight again, ready to go on the offensive. And they said, hey, let's go back and pick at the Byzantines again. They seem to be having a hard time. They should be easy pickings. And so the Umayyad Muslims put together a force to besiege Constantinople itself. I mean, after all, why chip away at the edges when you can go right to the heart of the empire and knock out the capital with one fell blow and assimilate all their lands at once? And to that end, the Umayyad caliphs put together a massive force of 180,000 men, which is very large, even by modern standards. That's a very large military force, 1,800 ships, and set them off towards Constantinople in the year 717. This was a horrible time. The provinces of Armenia, Anatolia, and the Obsidian province had just finished a 5-year civil war within Constantinople that left a brand new emperor on the throne, a guy named Leo, Emperor Leo the Isaurian. He'd been in charge only for 4 months. Oh man, that you just got to think about that. 4 months on the job, and your country's getting invaded right at its heartland. That's awful. So they just concluded a 5-year civil war. They had a brand new green emperor who'd only been in charge for 4 months, and someone tells him, hey, 180,000 Muslims and 1,800 ships are on the way to the capital to blot our empire out of existence. Well, fortunately, Leo, even though he was new to the throne, he was not new to military problems. He had been a seasoned general in the past. He knew how to handle this sort of thing. The first thing he did was he went into the Balkans and he made an alliance with the Bulgars. I mentioned the Bulgars had been raiding Byzantine lands in the west. Leo went to them and he said, "Hey, you pagan Bulgars, I know you don't like us. We don't like you, but look, we have an Arab invasion coming, and trust me, the Arabs are going to be worse neighbors to you than we would be." And the Bulgars looked at the Byzantines, they looked at the Arabs, and they said, "Yeah, you're right. We don't like you Byzantines, but we'd rather have you here than the Arabs." And so they made an alliance with the Bulgars, and this was really smart. This secured the western theater of Byzantium, so they didn't have to worry about fighting a war on two fronts. And the Bulgars agreed to help fight off the Arabs. Second, as the Arab fleet came and surrounded Constantinople, they sent out ships with Greek fire, which was the secret weapon of the Byzantines. Greek fire was, nobody really knows what it was made out of, but it was like a primitive napalm. It was some sort of goo that the Greeks would fire or launch from their ships, and it would light the enemy ships on fire. It was difficult to put out. When you tried to roll around in it, it just spread it around more. It was painful to catch people on fire. The Muslims were in terror of it, and they destroyed so many Islamic ships with the Greek fire that the Muslims refused to go out in sight of the city anymore. So this tactic of deploying Greek fire against the Arab forces demoralized them and bought the Byzantines some breathing room. And the third thing that Leo did was he had his Bulgar forces start attacking the Muslim lines from the rear, that is, circling around behind the Islamic army, pestering them from the rear, which kept them hemmed in between the walls of Constantinople on the front and the Bulgar raiders on the back. This interrupted the Islamic supply lines and made it very difficult for them to get the supplies they needed to wait out the winter. Consequently, as winter descends, and as Providence would have it, the winter of 717, 718 was a particularly frigid winter. Most of the Arab livestock died, their supplies became exhausted, and many Arabs began to die. So the Caliph was not happy with how things were going at the siege. So in the spring of 718, as the winter frosts began to thaw, the Caliph sent his army reinforcements from Syria and supply ships from Egypt and Africa, hoping to resupply and reinvigorate his forces before the walls of Constantinople. Unfortunately, the crews of these ships, the rowers, were overwhelmingly Christian slaves. And when they found out they were being sent against Byzantium, the vast majority of them deserted or mutinied and fled to the Byzantines, thus depriving the Arabs of their reinforcements. The Emperor Leo led a daring sally out of the city and ambushed the new Arab army that was marching on foot before it could get entrenched. So by late summer, the remaining Arabs, they had been deprived of their reinforcements, who were driven off by Leo. They'd been deprived of their supplies. They'd been there for almost a year. They were starving. They were at the end of what they could possibly do. And to make things worse, a plague broke out in the Arab camp, which tended to happen in the old days in military camps when sanitation was not good and when sickness started to spread. It had a tendency to balloon into an outbreak of the plague. And so, afflicted by hunger, disease, constant pestering by the Bulgars, the Arabs decided to abandon the siege and give up. But that's not the end. No. It gets much better or much worse, depending on which side you're on. So the Arabs broke the siege and departed on August 15th. And if you're Catholic, you should recognize August 15th as the Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or as it was known in the East, the Feast of the Dormition. Yes, it was observed even in those early days. I know the dogma of the Assumption of Mary wasn't formally taught by the Pope until 1950 when Pope Pius XII declared it, but the actual feast, the theological reality of the Assumption of Mary, and that feast day was celebrated from a very early time. So even back in the year 718, they were observing the Assumption or the Dormition of Mary, as it was known in the East. And the Byzantines attributed Mary's intercession to their victory. When the Arab armies had first showed up, it seemed like, it was very dire straits, and now what just 12 months ago seemed like a very foreboding disaster was now a resounding Byzantine victory. And so they attributed this victory to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, as if to make her victory extra clear, the Umayyad fleet, as it was sailing back home to the Caliphate, got caught in a storm on the Sea of Marmara and sunk. The whole fleet was the huge amount of the fleet was sunk and destroyed in a storm on the Sea of Marmara. Only a few ships survived, and they're sailing down through the Aegean. So they just, picture this: they'd survived starvation, the frigid winter, the plague, and then they're sailing home, and the fleet gets destroyed in a storm. And then they're sailing home, and they're like, "Oh, geez, one thing after another. I can't believe we got hit by that storm." And then when they're sailing through the Aegean near the island of Santorini, I kid you not, a volcano erupted, and those ships that survived the storm were burned up in the volcanic eruption that they got caught in Santorini. I shouldn't laugh about it. I shouldn't laugh, but it's one of those things where you look at that and you say, there really is a God. There really must be a God. It's like Mary is brooming them all the way back to the Caliphate. So the ships that had survived the storm were burned up in a volcanic eruption on the Aegean near Santorini. Now, the Arab chroniclers, the Arab historians estimate that 150,000 Arabs died in the failed siege. Now, remember, the army had been 180,000, and so the Arab chroniclers estimate that of that 180,000, 150,000 died, which is about a casualty rate of 83%, which is pretty bad as they go. It was an extremely serious catastrophe for the Umayyad Caliphate, but a glorious victory for the Byzantines and for Christian Europe as a whole, because, of course, had the Umayyads taken Constantinople, they probably would not have stopped there. They would have continued to march west through the Balkans. They would have threatened Hungary and then the areas around Austria and perhaps Italy itself. And so this Byzantine victory, what I'm going to call a probably miraculous victory given the circumstances, was what stopped the westward advance of the Muslims into Europe. A few years later, the Muslims would suffer another crushing defeat in France under the Franks, and that would stop their eastward invasion because they were also invading Europe through Spain. But so this stopped the westward advance of the Muslims into Europe. The defeat of the Umayyad forces at this siege was so devastating that they would never make a serious attempt to take Constantinople again. It'd be another 735 years before they made a serious attempt to retake Constantinople again. The Muslim momentum into Europe was entirely halted. Now, not only was the Umayyad advance halted, but as a matter of fact, the very year the siege was broken, the very year this disaster befell the Umayyad Caliphate, a dissident movement rose up in Iran, which would culminate in the overthrow of the Umayyads eventually in the year 750, and their replacement with a new dynasty, the Abbasids. So this actually was this disaster was the beginning of a political dissent movement that would lead to the downfall of the entire dynasty. So this is one of those famous sieges from history, from Christian history, that we should know about. Things could have been radically different had the Umayyads taken Constantinople in the year 717. Very different indeed. We could have seen Islamic power extend over much of Europe. For all we know, all of Europe could have become Islamic. So the siege was broken. There was victory for the Byzantines. Not everything was hunky-dory, though. The empire had lost. They never retook those lands that they lost to the original Arab invaders under the Rajidun. They lost North Africa, Egypt, and Syria irreparably. But nevertheless, the Muslim expansion had been stopped. The army was reorganized on a model that would make it more mobile and better equipped to fight the Muslim threat in the future. And the ascension of this new emperor, Leo III, Leo the Isaurian, that is, brought an end to a generation of civil war and the beginning of a new period of stability as Byzantium learned to deal with the new situation, with its new neighbor on its eastern frontier, the Caliphate. And I think a pivotal point in this history of relation between the Byzantines and the Muslims was in the year 717, 718, when that Arab momentum was finally broken, when the siege of Constantinople was raised. So anyhow, really cool story. Isn't history interesting? I can't believe I've already been talking for a half hour about it. It's a wonderful story, and the history of Byzantium in particular is full of many such wonderful stories. Perhaps we'll have time to delve into them more in future programs. But for now, that's about all the time we have. I do hope you'll tune in again for another episode of Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord look kindly upon you and give you peace. God bless you, my friends.